next speaker is Kirsten DeMelo with the talk Suicide, a Bad Idea. Ms. DeMelo is a registered nurse with experience in critical care and case management. She is an active board member of the Spiritist Society of Baltimore and has participated in the Spiritist Medical Congress and multiple Spiritist symposiums here in the United States. Please join us in welcoming Mr. DeMelo. Miss.
It's okay, I consider myself to be gender fluid, so that's entirely okay. I'm not held back by my gender, that's totally okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wanted to thank for the invitation here today. And as my colleague had already said, Adrian, that this is a very tricky subject to talk about for the reasons that he did indeed state, because there very well could have been somebody in this room or somebody that you know that could have attempted or has crossed your mind. And I remember the first time it crossed my mind. I was 14 years old, and I remember this sensation that at the time, I didn't know that it was, as now as a nurse, what we would refer to in the medical field as suicidal ideation. At the time, obviously, I didn't know that term. But I remember having a sensation come over me that I just didn't want to be in this space anymore. A sensation that probably crosses a lot of teenagers' minds in some shape or form or another, except my desire was a stronger intent. And I remember sitting on the bathroom floor in my mother's bathroom, wanting to just feel something, that I was making some sort of attempt. So I remember grabbing this chain that I had that was all broken up, but it had jagged edges. So I tied it around my neck as tight as I could, and I just waited. And I remember, in what seemed like forever, my mother walked in eventually, and she just kind of looked at me and thought that I was joking around, and she left the bathroom and just shrugged her shoulders and walked away. That was my first encounter with suicide, or suicide ideation, if you will. And thank God for Spiritism, I came to understand the profound purpose and joy of life and the beauty that life has to offer us. Because for many of us, coming back in this life or in a new life is a tremendous challenge. Young or older, it doesn't matter. All of us endure something of a struggle. So I want us to, when we talk today, that we think about and we have compassion for those who have endured this. Because it's something interesting when we're dealing with mental illness or people who go through struggles. It's very hard for someone to understand unless they've been in your shoes. It's very difficult. And that's not to say that we can't be understanding of one another, because we can and we should, but there is something to be said of when you go through something and you experience it for your first time through your own experience, and then being able to empathize with someone else who's gone through it as well. So let's just try to be open-minded about one another's experiences. Robert Frost has this beautiful poem, and that's entitled The Road Taken. Over time, it's been given several different titles, actually. But the original publication was in 1916 in a book called Mountain Interval. That was the original publication, although it appears in many other different poetry books. The poem is rather long. You can Google it. I just wanted to bring the most inspirational part of the poem, if you will, in my opinion. And it reads, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." For people who commit suicide or who have suicidal ideation, make suicide attempts, in the book Memoirs of a Suicide by Ivone Pereira, by the spirit Camilo Botelho, we learn that people who commit suicide or who succumb to the weakness of suicide, if you will, it's not their first time. It's not. Most of the time, for those who suffer from mental illness or who have suicidal ideation. It's a mental habit that we acquire over many generations. That's why much like many people who have just the thought of it, although there aren't a lot of statistics purely on suicidal ideation, from my own anecdotal perspective in healthcare, I would say that there are a lot of people that contemplate suicide and that do not like to talk about it, don't tell family members. That's why usually you see people who commit suicide and their family members are in shock. They have no idea. They can't believe it. Just experienced this recently with a friend of mine whose brother-in-law unfortunately succumbed to his own weakness and took his life. And the whole family was in uproar about it because they could not believe such a nice, successful young man with a family had any reason to kill himself. And indeed, from our physical eyes, he didn't. He had a great job, a great family, he was young, beautiful wife, great kids, he was healthy, but he suffered from a demon inside of him that he could not control, and he lost himself in it. So that is the road we find ourselves in. Robert Frost refers to the road less traveled by, and that's when I speak today, I hope I'm not just speaking, I pray I'm not just speaking to the incarnates. I pray that I'm speaking also to those spirits that are here today that have taken their lives in the past, because they are here and we welcome you and we don't judge you and we love you. And for those who have attempted, who are watching the video later or on the web currently, we send you our loving vibrations with no judgments but an open heart. And we dedicate this lecture to you, to have hope and for you all to take the road less traveled and not to go down the same road you've taken before. And the interesting thing about this poem is that Robert Frost talks about the road that's traveled seems bright, seems inviting. And that's what happens sometimes when we suffer from illnesses or we have bad habits. We return back to the same old habits we once had because it's comfortable. It seems alluring. We've been there before. But we encourage you to take a leap of faith into a new perspective. Because life and everything in life is all about perspectives. Joanna DeAngelis repeatedly says a lot of our issues are issues of fixation. We are fixated on something and can't seem to pry our mind from it. I'm going to tell you a story to illustrate this. There was a man at an airport, and he went to Dunkin' Donuts. They had a sale on donuts, so he got 5 donuts for $3. He got the Wall Street Journal. He sat down at this large table, and he started to read the journal. And about a minute or two passed, and he heard like the ruffling sound of the bag. And he puts down the journal, and he looks. This homeless-looking man is eating his donuts. So he's like, oh, my goodness. So he wanted to keep himself composed, and he didn't want to freak out on the man because it looked like he was kind of homeless. So he said, okay, that's fine, whatever. He continued to read the journal and grabbed a donut himself. So he was eating his donut, the homeless-like looking guy was eating a donut. Another minute passed. He hears another ruffling of the bag, pulls down the journal, looks again. The man is eating another one of his donuts. He was saying to himself, I cannot believe this guy is eating my donut. So he said, well, I have to be kind, I have to be charitable, I have to be nice. Let me just keep my composure. It's okay. Goes back to reading the journal. Then he hears the sound that his flight is about to be boarded. So he packs up his stuff, and he puts his newspaper down, and he looks over at the homeless-looking man. And the homeless man, locking eyes with him, goes into the bag and grabs the last donut out of the bag. And they're just staring at each other. And for a second, neither one of them say anything. And the homeless guy breaks it in half, gives him half, and eats the other half. So the guy, in complete and utter disbelief, is like, I cannot believe the audacity of this man to eat all my donuts. But he thought, well, at least he gave me half of that donut. Well. As he was gathering all his things, because he really had to go to the gate, when he lifted up his bag, what did he see? His bag of donuts. Perspective. Perspective is everything. how we see something. Because in this moment, up until this point, you were thinking, wow, this homeless guy was really taking his donuts, right? Perspective is everything in our lives. And when you are at the brink, when you are suffering, when you are contemplating suicide, it feels as if the whole world is on your shoulders. And it's incredibly challenging for someone to come in and to tell you to view it otherwise. But through the loving eyes of Spiritism, we learn that we can have a broader and more deeper perspective of life. One such story is Kevin Hines. He's one of the 34 people in the world who have survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge and lived to tell his story. Out of all the ones who have survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, he's the only one that to this day, for the past 10 plus years, 17 now 2017, has dedicated his entire life since that experience for suicide prevention, suicide awareness. He's been on like every single national suicide board you can think of that exists globally and nationally. He's a great advocate. He gives great lectures. You actually can hire him to come and speak about it. And he has a really fantastic book. It's called Cracked, Not Broken. It's amazing. I recommend it because it's very uplifting and gives hope and also helps us to understand mental illness, because up until that point, he hadn't accepted his bipolar disorder. So it's very beautiful. I highly recommend this story. But what's interesting is one of the things that he says is that he didn't feel accepted. I think a lot of young teens and actually young adults feel the same. And maybe even, the more mature audiences also kind of feel like, you're always battling, wanting to, find yourself or feel accepted. Have you ever been in a situation where you believed something, but someone came along and said something different? I had this experience recently. I was doing some clinical work at the local health department, I won't say where, and I encountered something that really kind of shook me a little bit, because I was faced with this very problem of wanting to be authentic, but at the same time not wanting to be someone different in the crowd. And I heard one of the nurses say to me, "Oh, the population I work with are just, immigrants." And she rolls her eyes. So I said, "Oh, okay." So I asked her to explain, what her experience was, and she began telling me how, they rob all of our money because all of our tax dollars goes to them. They get so much more. And she goes on and on and on, and as she's talking, I kept playing in my mind how my parents were immigrants, and they came here, and they experienced this, and they went through that. And so I listened to her, and I tried to understand her. And instead of trying to correct her, I just offered her my perspective. So we left that conversation very interesting, actually. I learned from her, and she learned from me, and it was okay. But it's that idea that Brené Brown talks about in her book, Braving the Wilderness, this idea to be your authentic self and be okay with that. Joanna DeAngelis talks a lot about in the book, Existential Conflicts, Psychology of Gratitude, about self-acceptance, self-care, loving ourselves. And Brené Brown says something beautiful. She says, "Don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you don't belong, because you will always find it. Don't walk through the world always looking for evidence that you're not enough, because you will always find it. Our worth and our belonging are not negotiated with other people. We carry those inside of our hearts. It is our job to do that work on ourselves. Our jobs alone to do that work. But as a community of people, we can most definitely, whether we're Spiritist or Christian or Muslim or what faith we may find ourselves in, we can and should support one another. We don't need to go very far to study about the cases or have some real cases of suicide beyond the ones that I shared on Mr. Hines. But this is more so from the spirit world perspective. There's just two small cases I wanted to bring, a Mr. Bell interesting man. He was a family man, much like many cases of suicide I've encountered as a nurse, seemingly, quote unquote, normal, had everything, had a great family, had a great job. But at some point in his life, he had some sort of break. He began to experience hallucinations, paranoia, and soon that became such a mental burden that it eventually led him to kill himself. And, of course, Kardec and his group of workers evoked him, and he gives an interesting tale of his life, that in actuality, his mental break, if you will, actually was an echo from the past. And in the book Action and Reaction, they talk about this echoing from the past, that sometimes when people reach a certain age in their life and it's like something explodes in them, it's an echo from the past. It's something that triggers us in this life from the past that must be worked on. And in this case, this man had been going through this very thing. He had not wanted to accept some difficulties he was experiencing emotionally. So for him, he gave in to the weakest part of himself. But as always, Kardec and the noble spirits always recommend prayer. Not just us praying for that spirit, but also encouraging those spirits as well who've taken their lives, who communicate, to open up their minds for prayer as well, that they pray for themselves. There are many different cases related to suicide. There are double suicides we see in the news and in stories. One other interesting case was a mother and son whose son was rather young, maybe in his 20s, 30s, got an illness. It's part of his reincarnatory plan for him to pass away at an early age, and it's part of the mother's reincarnatory plan to experience that. Well, what ended up happening is that the mother did not accept the death of her son. And immediately after her son died, she walked to another room and gave in to her weakness and took her life. But much to her surprise, when she woke up on the other side, who was not there? Her son. He was there, but she was unable to see him and would not see him, the mentor said, for many, many years. Now, God doesn't punish. Now, there's often this idea of punishment. It's not punishment. It's education. It's a learning that us as immortal spirits must experience. Because that's the law. We're born, we die, we're born again, we're constantly progressing. That is the purpose in everything, in all of this. Is that ultimately, even if we lose ourselves in the moment of weakness, of suicide, we have to come back and do it again, and again, and again. And many times when a person commits suicide, it may take up to a century, 100 years, statistically in the Spiritist data, if you will, to correct one singular act. And not only the act itself, but all the lives that it affected in a negative way. There are many stories about this in the Spiritist literature that you can read about. But I did want to bring a very interesting case to help illustrate the beauty of God's wisdom and the planning of the higher spirituality. Because let us not even think for a second that someone who gives in to the weakness of suicide is destitute. And that's it. Part of the suffering that Camilo Botelho talks about in this book, he says that half of the suffering that a post-suicide in the spirit realm that they suffer from is the constant thought that that's going to be eternal. That is what plagues them. So please, when you are thinking about, because our thoughts have power, when you know someone that's committed suicide, or even currently, right now in this very moment, do not send out that vibration that, oh, how horrible it's going to be once they reach the other side. They're going to be suffering for eternity. Not quite. There's a case in this book. It's the case of Amadeo Ferrari, that's how I'm going to pronounce it, and Felicio the slave. I'm going to make this short, but I recommend you to go. It's in chapter 18 of this book. Amadeo was a young man, had a very good job, again, another banker, and found the woman of his dreams, was planning to get married, everything was set, things were great. Except what ended up happening is that he discovered that he had throat cancer and tongue cancer, and that he didn't have the money for treatment. This is the late 1800s. So what did he do? Well, he decided to steal money from the bank, and he stole a lot of it for cancer treatment. Well, the bank found out. So he realized he was in a very bad predicament. So he said, either I can go to jail, die of cancer, or I can just take my life and be done with it. Obviously, he chose to take his life. When he reached the other side, he suffered a tremendous amount until he was rescued by the Mary's caravan, if you will. The Blessed Mary, they have this named caravan of workers that go into the Valley of the Suicides to help and rescue a lot who are suffering. So what's really interesting in this book is that they tell us is that there's a whole university sort of setup for those who have gone through suicide to be re-educated, and they go through a genuine, if you could think about the ways in which we run our universities here, we have different professors, different classes, you have clinical experience, and that's what they experience, and it's very interesting. They go through different therapies as well. So one such day in a group, in a classroom with a professor, whose name I cannot pronounce. It's a very long, and it doesn't even seem like a Brazilian name. It seems like it's a Greek name, Epinomadam. I can't pronounce it. Let's call him Mr. E. Professor E. Professor E, in this large group of post-suicide individuals who have already been rescued, and obviously at the university, one such person who was in this group was Amadeo. He calls Amadeo to the front of the room and says, we're going to begin our exercise of the day. And everyone, Camilo says, had a sensation of terror overcome them because they knew that this exercise meant self-reflection. And one of the things that suicides, what's very difficult for them, is to face the reality of their situation and to accept. So what wound up happening is that Camilo says that we don't have this device yet, at least he said at the time that was published. Perhaps one's already being made now, or prototypes being made now. It's sort of like a crown of sorts that gets placed on the head, and you do this sort of regression therapy, except this therapy is sort of, if there were like a screen, the whole class could see everything that the person in their mind they were seeing. Sort of like a, what's that called? Not 3D. Virtual reality kind of thing, except everyone else has access to your virtual reality and they can see it. So what they saw was that Amadeo, many centuries ago, he was a slave owner from Portugal, and he was doing some pretty nasty things with his slaves, separating families, husband and wife, mother and children, selling this one, selling that one there. And he had a group of his own slaves as well that he always kept. And one such slave, actually on his land, had a mother and father who had a couple of children, and one of which he just decided to pick out a young teen, barely a young teen, raped her. And the girl was so traumatized after her rape that she committed suicide. Felicio, the slave, turned to his slave master and basically told him that you're going to go to hell and this is terrible what you've done to my daughter. Amadeo didn't like that. And he said, okay, that's fine. He ordered one of the other slaves to cut his tongue out. And he did that. Cut his tongue out. No anesthesia, nothing, just cut it out. And he bled out and he went to convulsions and experienced a tremendous amount of pain. Everyone in the room is seeing this whole situation. Imagine how that felt for him and everyone. The little crown was taken off, and the professor began a conversation with him, talking to him about his experience. And he said, but that wasn't me. I'm not that person anymore. He said, indeed that you're not. The professor got silent for a second. He motioned for someone, and a door at the a door on the side of the classroom opened up, and a man came walking in. And he saw the man, Felicio. It was this African slave. And Amadeo fell to his knees, was crying. And the slave, no longer a slave, Felicio stood up, and with his ability to transform his face, he transformed into Senior Ferrari, Amadeo's father this past incarnation. And basically it was explained that this slave forgave him, was one of the ones that helped save him in the Valley of Suicides, had agreed to bring him back and in that life as his son to help him understand the beauty of life, lessons. This is the beauty that life presents to us. The opportunities in each life that presents to us. Independent of what we may have thought before, what we've gone through, we can and should begin again. We can and should support one another and have more safety nets for one another, both in our Spiritist centers, in our places of work, and across the board. Because suicide is at an alarming rate. If it were an epidemic, we would have a cure, or at least close to a cure by now. But mental illness is still not seen as it should. If I had cancer and I told you I was suffering, the chances of me getting more sympathy and understanding is higher than if I told you that I have bipolar disorder. We need to change our perspectives, like the man with the donuts, and view ourselves as brothers and sisters. Truly. And my last plea is this. Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. Horace Mann said that, a great educator, American educator. Know that you have purpose. Know that there is something great that you can manifest in your life. And don't go. Don't allow yourself to die. Not today. Don't wither away. Don't withdraw, because you have something inside of you that is beautiful and unique, and only you can manifest it. The man that helped save hundreds of thousands of lives off of the Golden Gate Bridge is an officer. I believe his name was Kevin Bridges, I believe. And he said one of the two questions he would ask people to make a fast assessment whether or not they really were going to jump or not, one of those questions were, do you have plans tomorrow? I heard it's going to be a beautiful day. And he said, majority of the time if the person said, yeah, I have my sister's birthday party tomorrow, then he knew he could talk them down. But when a person turns to you and says, no, I've given away everything, we know that it was a more serious matter. It's good for us to ask one another how we're doing, and if there's something that we can help to support one another in the best means possible. Because nowadays, in this country, there's a lot of interventions and support systems that exist. Because the person sitting next to you could be someone that is suffering, but has a smile on their face. I thank you all so much for your time today.